Hello, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to a special meeting of the Oak Harbor City Council. Today is Monday, September 12th. The time is 3 p.m. It is a special meeting, and the note is that no action will be taken at this meeting. So I'd like to start by introducing those here at the table. And if somebody then comes from the audience later, they can introduce themselves. I'm Mayor of Oak Harbor, Bob Severance.
Kim Campbell, City Council.
David McGough, Mayor of Oak Harbor.
Beth Munn, City Council.
Rick Albert, City Council.
Doug Merriman, City Administrator.
Brad Bluth, Civil Engineer 1.
Steve Powers, Director of Development Services.
Kathy Rosen, Public Works Director.
Dennis Lefevre, Senior Planner.
Erica Wassinger, City Council.
Joel Servadius, City Council.
So again, I'd like to welcome those to the table and call the meeting to order. And we have one discussion item, but it's broken down into, it looks like, 4 parts. So we'll start with item number A, the NPDES Phase 2 Stormwater Permit Requirement to amend the Oak Harbor Municipal Code and to make the use of low-impact development mandatory in development projects. So I'm guessing that I'm turning this to, okay.
I'm going to start.
Oh, good. Kathy Rosen, Public
Mayor,
Works. Yes, go
Mayor,
ahead.
members of the council. So we're here to give you an update on where we are in the process of updating our code to make LID mandatory as required by our NPDES Phase 2 permit. So where we've been, where we are now, our efforts to date, the challenges that we see associated with this project, and the next steps moving forward. So we have 5 basic requirements of our NPDES Phase 2 permit, and that's, for those that don't know what that is, that's stormwater related. We have to provide public education and outreach. We have to have a program for public involvement and participation, a program for illicit discharge identification and elimination. We have to have a program for controlling runoff from new development, redevelopment, and construction sites, and that's the topic for today's discussion. And then the final one is we have to have pollution prevention measures from our city operations and maintenance activities. So in 2007, we were issued our first NPDES Phase 2 permit. It was good for 5 years, and that required us to allow LID practices. Then in 2009, based on a Pollution Control Hearings Board decision, the permit was modified to require us to implement LID whenever it's feasible. And our current permit, which was issued in August of 2013, states that no later than December 31st of 2016, we shall review, revise, and make effective our local development-related codes, rules, standards, and other enforceable documents to incorporate and require LID principles and LID best management practices. So what is low-impact development? Oak Harbor Municipal Code has a definition that states low-impact development means a stormwater management and land development strategy applied at the parcel and subdivision scale that emphasizes conservation and use of on-site natural features integrated with engineered small hydraulic controls to more closely mimic pre-development hydrologic functions. What does that mean? My gosh. So really, what does that mean? Simply put, low-impact development requires that most stormwater stays on site when you're doing a new development. So some LID measures are pervious pavements, asphalt, concrete, and pavers. So this is just a schematic of what pervious asphalt would look like, how it would be constructed. And pervious pavements are one of the workhorses of LID development. So here's some pervious concrete. We have some out at Fort Nugent Park. And the water basically doesn't leave that concrete area if it's working as designed. And pervious asphalt. Pervious pavers are another option if people want to go that way. We don't see too much of that. Another workhorse of LID is bioretention, also known as rain gardens. They can be street side in the public right of way, or they can be on private property. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later and some of the challenges with each. Another LID measure is reduced amount of hard surface, such as reducing the roadway width or reduced lot coverage. So many LID developments have very narrow roadways, which can present some challenges when
If that's still.
yeah.
No, you see his beard.
It can present some challenges making sure that there's adequate access for fire trucks and solid waste collection.
And just people.
And just people, yes, and just people. And then some ways that DOE has suggested that we can reduce the hard surfaces on lots are shared driveways and those kinds of things. And then finally, DOE has suggested that a dispersion area, which is an area that is left in its natural state when you're developing a subdivision, where the stormwater can be directed to disperse in that natural area. So it means leaving a large area of the subdivision undeveloped.
This only applies to new development.
New development and redevelopment.
So my neighbor's house and my house, it doesn't apply. But we get a lot of runoff, both of them. His is pumped out of the backyard.
Yeah, it wouldn't apply unless I
we-
think the house is torn down and the property is redeveloped.
Thank you.
I think the more common application in redevelopment would be in a commercial setting. So the examples that Kathy's been showing so far are just residential, but please keep in mind that when we talk about this, it also applies to non-residential development as well.
Thank you.
So I'm going to turn this over to Dennis now to talk about our efforts to date.
Should we see, are there any questions
Yeah,
so far?
It's just kind of a little bit of background.
Does the modification of this thing, when we're starting to have on-site, in other words, no off-site discharge from, let's say, an individual property, does that plat still require the installation of a detention facility?
Generally, yes.
Generally, yes. But if you are going through all of the source of treatment and theoretically you don't have off-site discharge, why are you going through the on-site stormwater control?
Each design is going to be very different depending on the soils. And one thing you'll see later in this presentation is the DOE is requiring intensive soils investigation as part of the early part of the project. They have to do a soils map and show where the water can be put back into the ground. And in certain circumstances, the water will be able to go back in the ground through these things like pervious pavement and bioretention. Other cases, they'll need both that and ponds. This is going to be more strict than we're used to. It's going to have more stormwater facilities.
So the city engineer, Brad, you have the flexibility to look at the geology, the topography,
Yes.
and the vegetation to be part of a formula that says you can have all on-site or partial on-site infiltration, and maybe part of that formula includes some retention. If you can't infuse all of it on-site, you'll have to hold it someplace.
From the modeling that I've seen so far, most plats will have a detention pond plus items like pervious pavements and bioretention. Now, the ponds may become smaller as they do the pervious pavement and bioretention, but they'll probably have both from what we've seen so far.
We'll wait and see on that one. We don't have a choice.
No, we don't.
We don't have a choice. We're going through this presentation. The council's going to have to approve it, but we don't have a choice. This is one of those things we can't say no. We disagree, correct?
Correct.
And then we're going to duplicate stormwater management in many cases. Because before, when we put in the retention pond, it was, you had to retain it on site at the pre-development rate
Correct.
for our area.
Yes.
And we have to go through the Western Washington hydrology model and not the old Santa Barbara like we used to have
Correct.
here.
That's correct.
We don't have the same rainfall here that they have in Cedar Woolley or even in Seattle, but we still have to fall into that formula.
Correct.
And then at the same time, I'm on my pedestal now.
I'll
Excuse
give you
me.
about one more question.
One more question. One more statement. And then we talk about affordable housing. So
There's-
put it together.
I'm going to touch on some of those points later on in the
All right.
presentation, Mr.
All
Warren.
right, I'm stepping off my platform now.
Some areas have already implemented some of this. Some of the, it's not Saratoga Habitat for Humanity. There's some driveways over off of Crosby Road that are those pavers in grass on how well it's working. NFCU has the permeable asphalt. And so, I mean, so there are some. Is there anyone kind of making sure that this truly is working? Or, you know, the rain garden in front of Walgreens looks fabulous. I hate water prisons. They're ugly, they collect trash, and I think it's, oh, a kid, let's climb over the fence. So I'm just throwing that out. I know we have to do this and stuff, but we have maybe a little wiggle room, whether it looks like a water prison or it's a rain garden or, you know, whatever. I'm just, is someone kind of watching how some stuff that's already been done is working or not, or no? Too busy?
Yes,
can't-
Brad keeps a
Okay.
really close eye on it, and some is working well, and some is
Not
failing.
so.
Okay.
And with Kendall Walshins, who's one of our public works staff, she inspects all of these facilities at least annually
Mm-hmm.
and enforces actions to make sure they're working. So there is an aesthetic that, there are aesthetic challenges that will come with some of this because a lot of them are depressions like ponds, they will collect trash, etc. And there's only so many things we can do as a city because this is mandated on us, the bioretention,
right.
we will collect trash, it's windy here. But I know in 2011 when we redid our code, our subdivision code, we did put in more aesthetic requirements for detention ponds, so, and there's more fencing requirements and safe slope requirements. So hopefully the water prison thing is gone, even though we'll still have detention ponds in some flats.
Yeah, I know the grade and how much water and to keep it safe for kids. So, no, I know we've been working on that. I just hope it can still.
We're working on it. We're trying. We want a pretty city and balance it with affordable housing too.
Okay, thank you.
All right, good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I would like to present what we basically have done to date. But initially, what I'd like to address is what we've done in the past, and specifically Brad kind of alluded to this. About 5 years ago, we were awarded a technical services grant from the Puget Sound Partnership, which allowed us to work with AHBL, the consulting firm that has expertise in low-impact development. And through the course of a few years, we actually created a large piece of low-impact development amendments to our municipal code. And as you can tell, 4 chapters were specifically focused. And in the proactive action of the council, we actually adopted those amendments to the 4 chapters through a series of ordinances. So that really kind of got us going in the right direction about 5 years ago, and that's building a pretty strong base for us to look at this effort specifically. What we are doing as far as this effort is following a toolkit that the Department of Ecology has put together to help local jurisdictions implement this required LID code amendment process. And it prescribes 6 basic steps. And as you can see, step 1 is to assemble a project team, or in our case, teams. And we've done that. We pulled staff from the administration department, public works, development services, and of course, project managers have been assigned to Brad and myself. So that's what I've kind of termed the core team that's given us the guidance to move this project forward and give us some of the parameters from which to work with. Also identified in the toolkit is that a recommendation that we form an internal team, which kind of goes down a little deeper than just the management team, but also pulls in some folks that actually deal with this on a daily basis. Garbage truck operators, if we're talking narrower streets, they could be impacted. Stormwater inspectors, pulled in those types of people that actually we will be dealing with this type of code amendment in their line of work. Development services, we went, pulled in Ray from planning, who deals with code and lot sizes and zoning and that type of thing. Building inspectors and the building official we pulled in as part of this internal team. And as well as the fire department, we pulled in Ray to address some of the issues that he could see from his emergency response aspect. And then the core team members also participated in this series of internal team meetings. Another recommendation from the Department of Ecology, which we followed up on, was creating an external team. As you can see, we basically had 6 primary areas of interest that we thought would be affected by the implementation of this LID code. SICBA, the Oak Harbor Public Schools, the Conservation District, as well as we pulled in a local engineering firm, realtor, and contractor into this group. We had a series of about 5 meetings beginning in March, running through about June, and we presented basically what we're presenting to you folks today, what this code is doing, how it's going to impact us, and looking for their feedback to see how it might potentially impact their interests. We also had good representation from the core team at all of these meetings as well.
Dennis, before you go on, just for the council and the audience benefit, the public schools may not be immediately apparent why did we include them. If you think about it, they have some of the largest impervious areas in our community. So you think about parking lots and playgrounds at all of the schools that we have, because we also know they're constantly, seemingly constantly in a redevelopment mode in order to accommodate new buildings, new kids, etc. And so this has a large effect on what they're doing in terms of planning those spaces. So that was the main reason that we included them in this team, so that they could be well versed on what's coming.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So we feel we addressed step 1 by assembling the proper teams pretty adequately. Step 2, the toolkit identified really broad general topics from which we needed to work from as a base. There were 12 of these general topics, and you can see the first 6 here. The second set deals with streets and roads, critical areas, shoreline management. It really covers a broad range of general areas that we needed to address. It was important that we walk through each one of these general topics with those groups that I mentioned just a little bit ago, so that they understood what those general topics were and potentially how we would be needing to amend our code to address those topics. So we feel we accomplished step 2 by having everybody at the table understand these topics. Step 3, we started to get into a little bit more of the detail. It calls for review of the existing codes and the regulations, and what Department of Ecology basically termed is the gap analysis, and that's truly, in a sense, what it is. What does our code, or what does not, what our code doesn't address as far as what the Department of Ecology is looking at for implementation of the low impact development. They identified under the general topics additional subtopics, and I'll give an example in just a minute. And then also under the subtopics, they listed a series of considerations for each of those subtopics. So what they're saying is, okay, we have the basic general topic. What are some of the layers underneath the general topic that we want you to look at? And then what kind of considerations could we ask or look at for our code to make potential amendments? So what might make it easier is to give you an example. The general topic that I picked was landscaping, native vegetation, and street landscaping. The subtopics that were prescribed by the Department of Ecology included tree preservation, screening, landscape requirements for street frontages, and parking lots. And the considerations were, well, can vegetation planted within the LID facilities, such as bioretention facilities, count towards the site parking or perimeter screening requirements? So that's what you have to kind of ask yourself. Does your code address that consideration? In our case, yes. As a matter of fact, we do allow LID to be counted towards the vegetation that's included as part of the parking or perimeter screening. So what we are actually doing is kind of checking the box that says, yes, we've addressed this consideration, documenting where that consideration is met, and moving on to the next one. So that's been our process to date. So the documents that we've been using as part of this exercise, obviously the Oak Harbor Municipal Code is the one carrying most of the weight because of that piece of work that was done about 5 years ago. We've got regulations in all of those documents, and I'm not going to go through each one, that potentially could deal with LID or maybe should deal with LID. And then the last one is the comprehensive plan, which is more of a policy-oriented document, but with our most recent update, we've thoroughly addressed low-impact development in our policy for the comp plan. So the next step is step 4, and that's the one that we're kind of entering into at this point in time. Brad and I have been locking ourselves in my office and working for stretches of time to see where in those documents we have had existing code that basically addresses those considerations. We've got a 24-page document that identifies each consideration and the code that sometimes appropriately fits that or addresses that consideration. So what that is doing for us is identifying the gaps. And then what we will be doing is, well, is there some way that we need to address that gap? Are we addressing it in some other way? Can we maybe amend or change a code by just some wording that would address that consideration that is not addressed? Or if we don't feel that there's a change necessary due to maybe a conflict in another regulatory document that we have, we would just document that and indicate, well, no, we're not going to amend our code to address that because it would be in conflict with another document that we've already adopted. So that's pretty much the step that we are engaged in at this point in time. The following 2 steps obviously is the review process and adoption. We'll have a staff review. We plan to take this back to that external team, have them review some of the amendment package that we are preparing. Obviously it'll go through the Planning Commission and with their recommendation come to the City Council later this year. Step 6 is calling out, making sure that there's a successful implementation of this package. I think that's just going to have to stand the test of time and see how things actually work for us. We might have to bring some of these codes in and tweak them to some degree, or maybe make some additional recommendations as we go along this process. But there's going to be an education and an outreach part of this whole implementation process, as well as training for the internal staff, because this is a new ballgame for a lot of folks. So with that, what are some of the challenges that we are looking at? Are any questions on that?
Yeah, so before we go to that, let's see. Let's take a pause. That was a lot of stuff in a relatively short number of slides.
So that's the city's efforts to date to meet the permit requirements.
Yes.
And if we don't have any questions, we'll be going on to challenges associated with this project.
I might make just a couple of comments. Did you have a question, Beth?
Oh, just a comment. When you make a street narrower, there's less parking on the street. And unless they have a double garage, where are those cars going to go? Park it on their lawn or clog up the street so that nothing can get through. I'm sorry. In an apartment, they're going to have 2 people with 2 cars. And so is there some kind of planning or mix into it I just know coming down Scenic Heights, and that one apartment hasn't been finished, but the next one has, and it's better because we have a code that you can only keep a car on the street for so long. But some of those cars don't move for the limit, or they don't get caught. I mean, it's nature. They can't afford a big house with a big driveway. They're gonna have 2 cars, and we've got a narrow street, and you can't park that many cars in the street. So has someone thought of some solution on, okay, builder, you gotta have a longer driveway now. It's permeable surface, but it's gotta be longer so that they can fit the cars on it, or something, or an extra lot within the unit. Just
We've thought about all of those problems.
good, thank you.
And unfortunately, it's really easy to identify the problem. It is less easy to identify the solution. But a number of the ones that you talked about, we've given consideration to. In fact, if we go back to 2011, when we updated the subdivision code and the landscape code and the clearing code, we spent quite a bit of time. In fact, Brad and Ethan Spoo, one of our former senior planners, spent some time doing parking surveys, just going around the community looking at how neighborhoods were being parked. And so we actually at that time tried to account for sort of society and parking and how our community really works in terms of requiring additional parking for visitor parking for homes, incorporating the concept of little parking courts somewhere in the neighborhood. But the problem then, of course, is that by doing that, you're increasing the amount of hard surface that you're parking on. And if we increase the amount of hard surface, then we're dealing with more water. So it's, it's like this, right? We've got problems sort of going both ways, but we're spending a lot of energy trying to figure out how best we're going to address those. And the answer may in fact be to provide some flexibility in there and leave the solution to the designers. Not have the city try to determine in advance what the creative solution is. Just set up a framework where we can respond to creativity from that site planner, that engineer, that architect. That may turn out to be our best course of action. We will still have some ideas and some in the code, but I think we want to rely on their creativity.
You probably don't want to get into all these what-if scenarios, but it kind of ties in with your talk and the other one. We have this situation in our current code, now this is DOE issue, parking in consolidated soils, compacted gravel and stuff like that is considered impervious, right?
Yes.
95% in that range. So we have a situation, and I'll use this as an example. It's called, I think it's generally called the Copeland property. We all identify that. That thing has been used for years as a parking lot, carnival, all that kind of stuff. I think it could be considered consolidated soils. Yes or no? Probably.
It's not by the DOE. I think it's arguable about whether it's consolidated or not, because the organics in the top are certainly going to receive some of the moisture. The thing with the gravel is you strip off the organics. So there's probably a degree of compaction from driving.
Well, there used to be a building there, a lumber yard, and all that kind of stuff. It's hydraulic fill in there now. So the
Okay, so you're talking about
pre-development
from past,
one is, pardon?
Are you talking about from compacted from past use or from recent use?
From past use, just the years that it's been there. It's, first of all, it's a hydraulic fill area, right? Yeah.
Yes, but in terms of the code amendment that we're talking about, the question, maybe we didn't understand the question.
Well, let me get to where the
Oh,
question is
sorry.
really going. So if you, let's say, have that property, and let's say there's 50,000 square feet that is consolidated, so it would be classified impervious. Somebody develops down there, will they get a credit for that because they are going to create new hard surfaces, but do they get a credit for the amount that's there now?
They would not under current code. I'm not sure of a mechanism to do that. Haven't seen that situation addressed yet. And that particular property actually would probably be exempt from all of this because it drains to, it's immediately
Well, that's
adjacent.
the other part. It comes into the isn't the distance from the outfall like 200 feet or something like that?
The saltwater is an exempt water body,
Yeah.
and depending what's between the saltwater and the developed property, these may or may not apply, these new rules. It depends on the conveyance, whether it's man-made, stable, and non-erodible, and not flooding. So projects that are right on the waterfront may not have to do this, may be exempt.
But you
Most
keep
projects-
saying may. We're going to say yes or no. Or
Well, each
most likely
site's a
gonna
little
say
different.
yes.
Each site's a little different.
Yeah.
And that one probably would be exempt, but most properties in the city aren't going to be
So
exempt.
see, I think it'd be valuable to people to know ahead of time on their properties which are exempt and which aren't exempt. And if they already have classified hard surfaces, they certainly should get a credit for this at the same rationale as you get credit for if you're remodeling a building, you get traffic credits in there. You already have X number of traffic
Right,
trips in
right.
there.
So are we talking about a flow control modeling credit through the Department of Ecology? For
Yeah. Rate of runoff will be one side of it, but also the infiltration's got to be the other side.
Right. So generally for most new development and redevelopment in Western Washington, the Department of Ecology mandates that you consider the existing condition, no matter what's there. A mall, you could be tearing down a mall. The existing condition for your modeling is second growth evergreen forest. It doesn't matter what you're tearing down. They're making the person mitigate for what's happened in the past throughout the community, not just their property. Now,
So there were evergreens in the marsh down there before they did the hydraulic fill?
okay, so that's a unique property. I'd have to think about that one a little bit, but in general, I'm talking about for most of Western Washington. Now, there are some areas of prairie where they can, where it was documented as historic prairie, where the pre-existing condition, so before today, basically before European settlement, what you can put the input to your modeling as prairie, which has more runoff than evergreen forest. And we are actually one of those few communities in Western Washington that had prairie, and I've already had discussions with the Department of Ecology. We need to map where the Gary Oaks were, turn a map, they'll approve it or something, and we can say, okay, for people within this area of a historic Gary Oak prairie, your pre-existing condition is not second growth evergreen forest, it is prairie, so the size of your facilities will be smaller. The property you're talking about is really unique. There's not many left on the waterfront and not many left where it is filled. So,
But I think it's a great example, if I could bring it up just a notch or two. Already, stormwater review and stormwater regulations are really a site-by-site analysis, as you well know. It's even more unique now for each site because
Okay.
the level of analysis is heightened, and I think either Kathy or Brad will speak to that a little bit later. But the amount of work at the very front end of the process that the private consultant or the city's engineering consultants would have to do for one of our projects is greatly increased through the application of these regulations. So there is no more, generally this is how it works. It's going to be a very site-by-site analysis, and the decision and the answers will be unique for each property.
And then you have to send each application in to DOE for approval?
No.
Or it's, okay.
We retain local control
Okay.
over that. But our obligation, and through the council's action, will be to adopt a code which will be permit compliant. And then we'll also be obligated to make sure we're following it. And so when Department of Ecology comes in future years and essentially says, let's open the books and see how you're doing in following these rules, we'll have to be able to demonstrate to them that we've been following the rules.
which that includes reviewing against the manual that we'll adopt of theirs, and also construction inspection, and also follow-up inspection for maintenance.
Yes, on the external team, we have been meeting with them. What are their roles? Are you providing them education that the new code will be coming? What are their roles? Do they have input to make to provide for this new LID?
We had a series of discussions where we went through a lot of detail. I think we had 5 meetings, 5 or 6. And they were hour and a half to 3 hours or something each. We kept lengthening them as we went on because there's so much to discuss, but we talked with all those different groups and we had a very casual discussion about their concerns and what they've seen work well and what hasn't worked well. And what bottom line that we learned is they want flexibility designed in the code, and that's what Steve was talking about earlier, is every piece of property is unique now. The soils are what's going to control a lot of this design and the layout of these projects, particularly plats. So depending on the soil type, particularly the percolability of it and the topography, what kind of native vegetation they already have on site, you may get very different products around the city. And so what we're working towards with our code is allowing for more flexibility in plat design and commercial design. But I think plats are going to have a bigger challenge to get their minimum densities.
So we were using them, Mr. Pagao, as a sounding board,
Right.
both to give them information, but to get feedback back from them. Some of them had already had some experience in providing or doing LID design. Some of them are, realtors trying to understand what this might mean to the marketplace. So we were really looking for their response and their reaction, I think is a good word, their reaction to this new code.
Yeah, that's one of the things, how will it affect the realtors? They're the one that will be looking for buyers of property. But the builders association, they're the one to be affected. They're building the houses that with LID requirement.
We'll have the builders, the developers
Right.
themselves. Sometimes it's the same entity, sometimes it's different, as you know. So we tried to have as broad a net as we could when we reached out to these folks.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Councilman.
Oh, yes.
Councilman Watson.
Well, I have a lot of questions, but just two for right now.
So you were talking about the more extensive review of permits that come in because they are going to be so specific to different areas or sites in our city. So what would happen, for example, if a existing home in an existing neighborhood had to pour a new driveway? Would something like that, or put a new roof on, or have a big landscaping project that that would require a permit? Would that go through that extensive permit review and have some of these requirements and costs associated with it that's put on the contractor or homeowner?
Generally, no, not for things like roofs. Depending how big the driveway is, it might trigger this, but it'd have to be a rather large driveway.
So
We have
where
very large.
are those specifics going to be in our code, or is that from the DOE?
Our code will adopt the new 2012 stormwater manual that is about that thick, and then it has a sister book called the 2012 Low Impact Development Manual that was prepared by the Puget Sound Partnership and WSU, and it's about that thick. And almost everything that regulates development as far as the triggers, the warrants, and then these best management practices like bioretention, pervious pavements, those are in those two books.
So our code is going to say, look at the books.
Yes.
Our code is going to reference that because that's how we have to either, and I think I have this right, we either have to adopt their manuals, or we have to create our own, which is the equivalent.
We probably can't contradict those books.
Right.
We cannot.
We have to
Right.
meet
And
or exceed.
So those thresholds will be in there, and then it'll be the joint between the staff and the consulting engineer to know whether that threshold is being exceeded.
So in the big picture, one more along those lines. What if an existing home in our city, heaven forbid, something happens and it has to be torn down or it's destroyed, and it has to be completely rebuilt? I assume that would go through this major permitting process and following all of these LID requirements?
It's not going to trigger all of them. It's going to trigger, there's several square footages that increase requirements as you build bigger. So a typical home is going to trigger kind of the lower end BMPs. It's not going to require you to go do a pervious road. It may require a pervious driveway and bioretention in the front yard. This latest manual lowered those warrants to pull in the single family home as an individual project. It used to be with most of those did not get triggered for best management practices, stormwater best management practices, but they dropped those triggers down to try to catch most single-family homes.
And then what, has anybody done any or given you any feedback about a cost estimate of this? You know, whether it's put on a homeowner with a builder
I
or
have heard.
contractor, of how much more that's gonna cost to engineer, how much more it's gonna cost us to,
It's going to be more
Go through all of
expensive for the
that.
engineer, the developer. It's going to be more expensive for us to review. It's going to take a lot more time. It's a much more tedious design, and the maintenance is more labor intensive. I've heard costs. I spoke with a developer who does work in Pierce, Snohomish, and King County. He told me about $35,000 per house now is because of this. And I've heard some costs up in Lake Whatcom area, which is a drinking water reservoir. Those costs were close to that also. It definitely does conflict with affordable housing. Now, when we started down the LID road years ago when the state was pushing this, we were told it was cheaper. The Puget Sound Partnership and the Department of Colleges consultants saw it was cheaper to build, cheaper to maintain. You have to put pipes and catch basins in. I think somebody here is going to point out something in the manual we found recently about putting pipes and catch basins in addition to all this as a redundant system, which is not what they sold us. Well, they didn't sell us on it. We had a lot of discussions with them over the years about this, and it's been mandated. So there is a cost issue, definitely, and it's probably going to require more staff, more equipment.
on the city,
Yes.
on the city's end. And so to that, so we're gonna put a burden on somebody that's building a home, or even putting a new driveway in potentially, or new
Yes.
landscaping, or anything that they're doing to the outside of their home, I imagine.
Most of
in that
those
book.
things in an existing home won't trigger this. Most of them won't.
Okay, well, that's good. So, but a new home, a new developer, that's gonna flow down to the homeowner.
Yes.
We're gonna increase our cost. We're gonna have an ongoing expenditure increase for our city. Are we gonna have an incoming revenue to support that? I mean, what is the plan for that for our city?
I can't answer that yet. It's something
Okay,
we're
I'm
trying
throwing
to
it out
work
there. I'm
through.
sorry, I'm just, the wheels are going.
It's
Okay.
good that you think about this, because these are
Okay.
things staff
Yeah.
has been thinking about for quite a while and trying to balance it and have discussions with the Department of Ecology.
But there's nothing that you know of, any other sort of an incoming revenue source for us to pay for this ongoing expense from?
There would not be
Anywhere that
there would
you
not
would
be an
know?
external
Okay.
funding source
Okay, okay.
that would help you with this. You put your finger right on it. It is a cost which is being passed down to the local government, which is somewhat in line with some of the challenges that we have if we're ready to make a slight transition here.
Can I make one comment before you get going with that one? We're talking about housing and stuff like that. It's about the developer paying. Developer isn't paying for any of it.
It's
They're
gonna
doing the
flow.
front end, passing it on. You and me buying the homes are paying for all of this. This extra $35,000, people coming in, that's who's paying for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, Beth.
Kind of off the wall. So if people buy or sell property, they have to acknowledge that there's a Navy base here and they may or may not be in a noise zone, has to do it. Okay, they're gonna buy a piece of property, commercial, to develop it, and is there gonna be something that says, well, this is considered prairie, so you only have to do this for your stormwater, or this is considered, it was probably evergreen, so now you're gonna have to do this for you. I mean, I could see people say, wait a minute, nobody told me about this regulation in development. I'm just,
Well, right.
it's off the wall, I'm just throwing it out there that this could come back and go, wait a minute, no one ever mentioned this when I was buying the property.
Right now, the standard is the evergreen forest until we produce the map. So when they buy a property, they just need to go buy the manual, the DOE manual. They need to be aware of what they're getting into. And so if we change and get our map together for the prairie, that's just kind of relief for them at this point, because most developers will not even expect that. Most of Western Washington doesn't have that situation. We're unique, so
Okay.
that's going to be an advantage for our local developers.
Okay, thank you.
One more. And then I won't ask any more questions.
No, this is why we're
Okay,
here.
You're talking about the evergreen forest map that, and this was established by, that
Well,
requirement is established by DOE. You
yes.
have to do the mapping for this area.
Yes, there's
Okay.
no evergreen forest map.
So,
that basically say
do we
where-
have a soils and hydrology map already in place?
We have So, there is a soils map. It's a starting place for investigation. It's the Natural Resources Conservation Service Soil Survey. And most people think of it as the SCS. It used to be the Soils Conservation Service. They changed the name about a decade ago. It's been around for 50 years, 60 years. It's just a starting point. You can't actually engineer from it. You're not allowed to by DOE's requirements. They require in-situation testing, expensive in-situation testing.
So that doesn't leave any room for even rainfall.
I'm sorry, you mean
Well,
local precipitation?
Yeah, for precipitation, yeah.
Um,
Because you have Forks that gets 100+ inches, and then around the corner, more than just around the corner, but still in western Washington, you have Swim, you have the San Juans. They're treated by the same regulation.
You're right, and the modeling does take in, for certain of these stormwater facilities, there's modeling where it does math based on where we are. Others are just cookie cutter where it depends on the soil size. It says, for example, an infiltration transfer rooftop is the same size in the same type of soil in Forks or Olympia or here. Well, in Olympia it gets like 60 inches of rain and Forks gets 100 something and we get 21. And I'm glad you brought this up because just about 2 weeks ago I brought this point up to the Department of Ecology training, and I said, why do we have to have the same length of trench when we get 21 inches of rain? I compared it to Olympia, I think it's 60, so we get about a third. And the answer was, if you don't do it that way, you're not in compliance with your NPDES permit. And it was just that.
That's the problem with this thing.
And
God is fighting for
Yeah.
us.
I'm the guy that don't like that show.
I recognize that the staff is only the messenger, but you know, I have a tough time, and I know it's going to get jammed down our throat, but I have a tough time saying, yeah, I think I'll just raise my hand and say, yeah,
So
because it's not right.
But what we can do here is where we have the opportunity to apply variation or flexibility, or to try to find something inside of the established model that works to our benefit. That's what we're doing.
We're trying very hard.
We're working really hard not to have a worst case scenario fits all kind of answer, because taken from one perspective, that's really where we're at. So we're trying to be as reasonable and provide as much flexibility as we can. But as you've correctly noted more than once, we're inside of a box that ecology has built for us. And so that's we have to operate inside of that box. And I don't think we're getting out of the box.
One thing at that training, we had some conversation before the class started, and I feel like Oak Harbor has tried, I would say, put forward more effort to provide local flexibility to developers to meet these requirements and still get things like the right amount of parking. We're going to try to make parking flexible so it's still there, but where we need to go narrow roads for some reason, we can go narrow, but maybe the parking's driveway, parking courts, or some parallel parking lanes spread out throughout the plat. That's just one example. So we're trying to set our code up to allow the engineers to come here and design each project to meet these LID requirements, yet still provide what we need as a community. And from our discussions, Dennis, is that what you gathered? That we were way ahead. I think a lot of other communities just kind of adopted this stuff without those thoughts. We're trying to ensure we don't box in developers into a situation where they can't build a product that anybody wants and that the community doesn't want.
Well, I plan to vote yay or nay with lots of thought.
So, great transition, I think, to challenges, because we've been talking about some of those. And there are three main areas that I think we're going to try to cover between maybe Kathy and myself here. Development, design, and review, community design, and maintenance, because we really see these as pieces that are working together but are also distinctive. So we've kind of been dancing around a little bit of this somewhat this afternoon, but obviously we can't just change the stormwater rules that want us to drastically decrease the amount of hard surface, that want us to set aside land area so the water can be dispersed across native vegetation property. We can't narrow up streets and do all of these things without making some other changes in our development standards. So you can't just change one piece of the puzzle because the rest of them aren't going to fit very well, I think maybe is the way to think about it. And so one of the biggest challenges is if we're going to place all of these restrictions on the development of property, how do we continue to allow, how do we allow the density to be met that is set forth by the zoning district? So right now, single family, you can develop 3 to 6 dwelling units per acre. Well, if we start whittling down on the amount of land which is available for development, that's going to reduce the amount of density or the number of homes that developer is going to achieve. That's not going to work, obviously. And so some of the rules that or regulations that Dennis and Brad are looking at are those which relate to density. So a lot of times what we're really talking about is lot sizes. And in order, at the simplest scale, it means lots get smaller so that you can get more of them. But that gets right to product, right? And it gets right to lifestyle. And while that might be a great solution, and I think I'm trampling over one of my other slides, but while that might be a great solution in a more urban area, it's a little more challenging here in a suburban/rural area to be talking about lots which are around 5,000 square foot in size, as opposed to 7,200 square feet, which is our minimum lot size now. Bulk and dimensional changes, that's a fancy phrase for things like setbacks. Again, how are we going to make all of this fit inside of that subdivision without making some changes to the setbacks? They're going to have to get smaller probably in order for things to fit, except when we need to have a longer driveway so we have places to park, right? And that gets also, speaking of parking, block and lot functionality. You know, we're accustomed to seeing subdivisions laid out in a particular fashion, fairly marketable fashion. That will likely change as we try to, and I think we have some example slides later on, that'll change as we're trying to balance all of these things inside of the boundaries of one parcel of property. Homes, parking areas, narrower streets, dispersion areas, natural vegetation areas, all of these things trying to happen on the same piece of property, our subdivision design is going to change. Review process. It's going to take more pieces of information in order to get into the review process. The things that right now that Brad needs to see in order to review a preliminary stormwater report won't get him to where he needs in terms of meeting these new codes. And I think there's maybe a bullet point later on that talks about that. It's going to take longer for us to review. One of the things that occurred to me over the weekend is that didn't make it into the slides. This is going to take us more time, but state law tells us we only have 90 days to do a subdivision. And that's hard and fast inside of the RCWs. That's 90 days from the day we determine it to be complete until the time we get it in front of the council. Now, when we're not working on it and it's in the developer hands, we have to stop the clock and it's on their side of the clock. But I'm not sure these two things work together very well. If it's going to take us longer to look at it, that's going to be eating into that 90 days pretty quickly. And you've heard us talk a little bit about increased costs. Certainly there'll be increased staff costs just in terms of the time spent on this. So whether that's new staff or not, it means that existing staff would spend less time on something else because we're spending more time on stormwater. And I added another piece to this one, which is I think it's possible that we may need outside consulting assistance for some of the reviews for certain aspects of it, maybe the soils portion of it. And it could be just because we can't handle it all with our existing staff. It could be because it's complex. So a lot of changes in how we do things as a result of these new regulations. Is this you or is this me?
This is me.
Okay. No, I couldn't remember.
So, and Brad, feel free to jump in at any point here, but there is going to be a significant increase of the upfront work that a developer is going to have to do. They are going to have to perform soil mapping on the parcel prior to designing the subdivision. And it's pretty extensive what DOE is saying that they're going to have to do to map the soils. There's also a feasibility checklist that they're going to have to go through. Remember I said pervious pavement and bioretention are the workhorses of LID. They're going to have to go through this feasibility checklist based on the soils mapping. You know, can they do pervious surfaces? How does bioretention fit in there? and then work down through some other LID measures to see if those will work. And then I think that's going to figure out, that's going to determine the size of any on-site pond.
There's a couple lists depending on the size of your project, and you have to start at the top. And the first thing that applies to your soils and your project you have to use. If that doesn't apply because of infeasibility criteria, you go to the next item. And previous payments and bioretention are actually the second items on these two lists, but the first two are going to be, the first item in each list is going to be largely feasible as communities. So we already know that previous payment and bioretention would be the workforces for most LID developments.
So one of the challenges with this is we're not sure that a lot of the engineers and designers understand what's coming. Brad and the engineering staff attend a lot of trainings from DOE on this issue, and they come back and say they don't see many consulting engineers at the classes. So this is going to be new to them. It's going to feel very different and feel like we might be just being difficult because we have to require that information, the soils mapping. That has to be submitted with the application in order for us to stay compliant with our permit. So it's not that we're not trying to be helpful, it's that we have to have that information. And was it you, Dennis, that said you talked with somebody in Mukilteo, or was it you, Brad?
It was both of us talked.
Mukilteo has adopted these regulations already, and the person that's handling the stormwater review has indicated that is the area she's having the most difficulty in, and that's getting the engineers to submit this upfront work because it's just new and it's different and it costs a lot of money that they're not used to spending upfront. So as I just mentioned, we have to verify all that geotechnical work and feasibility analysis, so they've got to submit the checklist, which is going to require additional staff time for review, and it all kind of needs to be put into that DOE model. So in the traditional design approach, this is to talk about how things are going to be different. The layout of a neighborhood is based on the shape of the parcel of land, existing street connections and topography, and basically they shape the land to fit what the developer wants. In the LID approach, which is what we're going to be moving to, there has to be this investigation of soils, and the layout is going to be based on the soil qualities and the preservation of vegetation. And essentially we're going to be shaping the plat to the land and looking at designs that will minimize the footprints of pavements and buildings, and that's going to trend towards more intense and clustered housing. So, you know, the one on the left is more traditional. The one on the right is most likely what we're going to see developers moving towards.
These are examples that I pulled out of, I think it was the low impact development manual. We're still going to stick with a gridded street system. The main difference to see here is these have the same amount of lots, except they're much smaller and tighter together on the right, and they've reduced the amount of road. The low impact development manual and DOE manual don't really get into street grid layout and transportation. They like to see streets minimized, but we have to balance our transportation system with LID, and so we're not going to see a lot of dead ends.
So
now it's my turn. But before I get into that, I'm going to go back to this picture if I could. Something that we've touched upon a little bit, but this is a great graphic example of it, is cost to the end user. So if you look at the example on the right with all of that green area, that's most likely ending up then in a tract, right? That is owned in common by the HOA. Somebody's going to have to maintain that, right? And so while it's very typical to have drainage tracts and other types of tracts in subdivisions today, generally I think it's safe to say they're much smaller than what we see in something like that. And as we all know, areas that aren't maintained become holding places for trash, etc. So there's an increased cost at the back end of the process here for the homeowners associations as well.
can you hold that for just a second?
Sure.
But the city doesn't have any authority to enforce homeowners' requirements for maintenance.
We don't, unless it's in an area where it's also part of, as you know, part of a drainage facility,
Right.
which is connected to our public system. My point is that at some point, someone's going to complain if it's not being maintained. And so somebody ends up addressing that particular problem. But you're right, we do not enforce CCRs and the
Yeah.
requirements.
You might have 3/4 of them help take care of it. Somebody else says, I'm not participating in that. And
Right.
there's no way to enforce it.
Not for us, but again, it's an issue because it's an end user issue, and we're just trying to make the council aware of the changes that we see for the homeowner as well. So, Kathy talked a little bit about how we look at or what the traditional design process is and the LID process, and she started to touch upon some changes to the built environment. I want to expand on that just a little bit. So, the resulting form or urban form here will be neighborhoods that are different than what we are accustomed to seeing. We've talked a little bit about shared driveways. The reason we might see those is to reduce that amount of hard surface. Maybe they need to be longer and shared so that we can have room for parking. We're going to see a different use of open space and potentially more of it, but perhaps not as centrally located or as usable. Compact development. You got a sense from that previous slide. If we look at and I think those are the same number of lots, right, Brad? Yeah. So you have the same number of housing units, but on maybe lots which are about 2/3 the size of the ones on the left. So it's going to yield a more compact development product for our community. Smaller setbacks. Brad has shown us some examples of some 3-story homes that I don't even want to contemplate because they are just, well, they're not Oak Harbor, that's for sure, but it's hard to envision a product like that in our community because it does have to be one that people are going to buy. And that's another part that we're still struggling with. It's not really in our purview, but we're still trying to figure out how does this all work. And so that's the housing structure change. It doesn't work very well when we're talking about single-story houses for folks that are getting up there in years and aren't looking for stairs. How does this all work when we have an increasing senior population? If we're still talking about single-family housing, they want to have single-story homes. That's pushing everything out, making it, a greater footprint on the lot. So competing goals, and again, trying to balance those things. Speaking of competing goals, how is this going to be really in conformance with the Growth Management Act? Is it going to be necessary for us to increase our densities to meet LID requirements? Yeah, we can do that. We can say we can build a more dense single-family product. That's going to skew our overall housing mix, and we have to keep our eye on that. But really importantly, we have a requirement to provide a range of housing for all needs and all income levels. So that's not just compact single-family standalone homes. We have an obligation to plan for and provide land for things like government-assisted housing, low-income manufactured home products, multifamily housing. And I think it remains to be seen how LID factors into some of those site planning challenges. Another big takeaway for the council today, I think, is that unlike many of the code projects that we work on, where we feel reasonably comfortable that we've gotten most of the answers to the questions before we come to you with it, there will be some things that I don't think we will know the answers to until we start working on actually implementing this. And frankly, we're not very comfortable with that. So again, here's a similar example to the one that Brad previously provided in there. You can see the difference in layout and some of the issues that we've already talked about.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see as maintenance challenges once these developments are put in the right-of-way, which is what Public Works is responsible for. The pervious roadways and sidewalks, that requires new specialized equipment to maintain. We don't have that. And it's going to require additional staff because it's going to take more effort and more time to do that maintenance. And then the bioretention, if it is in the right of way, who's going to maintain that? It's in order to keep it attractive and aesthetically pleasing and functioning as it's designed, it's going to require a lot of handwork, weeding, and that effort. And if it's city staff, it's going to require a significant increase in the amount of staff that we have to do that. And if we put it on the HOA, it will require staff to go out and inspect it periodically to ensure the proper maintenance and functionality. So we're going to have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But if we're going to allow bioretention in the right of way, there has to be that decision as to who's going to maintain it. And if it is in the right of way, there will be an increase in city staff effort. It's just to what degree, if we're maintaining it or if we're just having to inspect it periodically.
Question?
Oh, I do too. Sorry.
Excuse me. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I am. So what, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but just based on trends, I know that you guys know this very well. When do you see, how often do we get a new development with these that's going to have this new right-of-ways and these new, things that are going to be needed to done? I guess what I'm getting at is, when do we expect that we are going to need an upgrade to these maintenance equipments and staff for public works to sort of maintain these neighborhoods? What do you expect that, or how often does that happen? When would that happen?
Well, it's a great question, and actually may be somewhat of a saving grace for us here, because as we all know, new subdivision applications have really slowed down over the last half a dozen or more years. The one or two that we have in process right now one of them came in under the existing rules, so we're not talking about that for them. It's hard to predict, but I think we would reasonably expect to see a couple of applications probably after the first of the year, if building is taking place commensurate with the new squadrons coming. And so if that's the case, it's going to be another year plus probably before you see development happening, another year plus maybe before we're to maintenance. So not this budget cycle, but maybe the next budget cycle. Kathy, does that seem about right?
That seems about right.
Yeah. And I think one of the other real issues, and this is a big policy question, is if it's in the right of way, is it going to be a city responsibility, or will it be a private property owner responsibility? Because that has a lot to do with how we structure what we're going to do in terms of the code and the requirements that we impose through the process.
So, could I have a question? This NPDES 2 affects us, Anacortes, Coopville, but not Island County.
It does not affect Coopville either. We are
So-
the only agency in Island County that has a permit.
So development could actually move into the county or to Coopville.
It
If
could,
they-
to the degree that whatever that somebody's wanting to do is actually allowed under county regulations, yes. But the single family might be what we see pushed out into the county a little bit more.
One last, and then I'll go back to council. Some time ago, there were a group of cities that started an action against this type of regulation. I think I see Brad shaking his head. I think I looked at an action that Dr. Merriman sent me that included a dozen cities,
Yeah,
at least.
they lost in court.
Did they actually,
They lost.
so they actually did take that to an end?
I think it went to court. Or
It
did
at least
so-
went to the hearings board.
Yeah, I can't remember how far it went, but they absolutely lost.
Okay.
There were no concessions, I don't think.
Okay. Mr. Almberg, did you have a question?
Yeah, the question I have, I think, what is it, Chapter 11, for our public works maintaining sidewalks and street trees and stuff like that? Anyway, it's in our ordinance, where the property owner is required to maintain the sidewalk, the street trees in the adjoining, those public areas adjoining to their property line. Why wouldn't we have this kind of under the same philosophy?
If
You could.
you could.
And I think that the point that Kathy was making before is that they have to be maintained properly. Right today, that land that's adjacent to the homeowner's lot is probably just a grass strip. Maybe it's an old-fashioned drainage ditch that you can still mow, but it doesn't take an awful lot of thought and not an awful lot of time. Whereas this is more complex, so maintaining it takes a higher degree of work and probably more frequently.
And the reason I bring that up is philosophically, the private side can maintain those cheaper than the city side. We'll get more consistency if the city does it. But then you're having the rest of the community subsidize new neighborhoods who are under a new requirement. And so now we're distributing that burden on other people who have been paying for other public services. You know, initially I'd be more inclined to say that responsibility goes with the development and the buyers of that to make it equitable.
That would be our preference as well. However, it does have to be maintained.
Yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes, sir. When an application is made to develop a subdivision, would there be a requirement for the residents to form an association so that they can take care of maybe detention pond or the other open space which is not close to their residence? There are some open spaces there, like the one in Meadow Park subdivision. Residents didn't know that they're responsible for maintaining detention pond and asked the city to clean it up, and they found out that it was on CCR that they're responsible.
So when we go through the plat process, Mr. Pigal, the short answer is yes. There's a requirement for a homeowners association to take care of those common areas. But what we do also is through the notes on the face of the plat, we make it clear that if the HOA disbands, then that responsibility falls to each of the individual property owners collectively. So what we're doing is looking out for the public's interest. But they all start off with the requirement for an HOA, assuming that there was a common facility in that subdivision. Now, the older subdivisions in town didn't have any common facility that needed to be taken care of. It wasn't really till we got to the point where we had stormwater basins or open space or private neighborhood parks. Those are the things which triggered the need for HOAs to take care of those tracts of land.
So I would say that could be effective in making enforcement.
It can. Kathy's staff has to fall back on that occasionally when the HOA has gone away and we have an existing pond that's not being taken care of, right? And then it's a letter to all of the property owners reminding them that they have this joint responsibility to take care of that facility.
From a policy standpoint, would you include a maintenance bond from the HOA? I mean, it's not as expensive to pay the premium to have that security. In the event that the HOA doesn't take care of it, the city then has some financial collateral to fall back on.
It's an interesting idea. I don't know how long we can hold on to that. I mean, because the HOAs, when they get formed, they tend to be active, initially.
Yeah.
It's not until somewhere later in the life of the subdivision that somehow they fade away, the officers move, and nobody knows that they were really there, that kind of thing. So I don't know how long you could hold on to a maintenance bond, Mr. Allen.
Mr. Kim?
Help me understand something. Early on in this discussion, way early, there was a discussion about homeowners associations, and I thought somebody said that there's no enforcement involved. The city has no power to enforce anything in a homeowners association. And I immediately wrote down some questions here because I know a guy that chairs a homeowners association. I was going to talk to him about it. So
we don't have authority to to affect things inside of those CCRs, you know, the governing documents for those HOAs that are just private. House color, whether you can have a shed or not,
Yeah,
all of that
I'm
kind
not
of
worried
stuff.
about that.
Yeah, we don't have any authority in that area. Where we have authority is where they have a responsibility to take care of a common facility, like a drainage pond, that is connected to our system.
Okay, now there's the question. Who establishes, who tells them that they have to do that? Is it the city?
We do. At the
Okay.
beginning of,
And if they don't, we have the authority to,
to tell them they have to take care of it. Yeah, we
Okay.
do that
Okay.
actually the council does that finally for us when you
Yeah.
approve that plat.
Okay.
All of those conditions have been worked out. The notes are on the face of the final plat, and then they all reference something inside of the
Okay.
CCRs. And then one of the things that Brad does as part of that process is he reviews the O&M manual, so that there is something that tells somebody how they're supposed to take care of that stormwater facility.
okay, thank you, I misunderstood that earlier.
I might not have been clear, Mr. Campbell.
Okay, Mr.
So,
Omberg?
yes, on that enforcement issue, okay, it's in the CCRs that the homeowner association has to take care of that. The association doesn't take care of it, and the city steps in and takes care of it. Is the city inclined then to pass, as you said, pass the costs on to the individual property owners within the plat or the homeowner association? Is the city inclined to then attach a lien to those properties until they're paid? I mean, that gets into be a lot of administrative work, but when the property is sold, you know, you're gonna get your prorated share of $15 for maintenance.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with that part of our enforcement code because fortunately, we've never gotten that far. We've always been
Okay.
able to obtain voluntary compliance. It may take a few letters, it may end up taking a letter from the city attorney's office, but we've always been able to
So,
obtain compliance.
Don't make a problem where it doesn't exist.
Mr. Campbell?
I can give you an example of how that works. When my wife and I lived in Washington, the other Washington, there was a homeowners association where we lived. We were never told. There wasn't anything in the papers or anything. Did not know there was a homeowners association. When it came time for us to move to Scotland, we'd been there 6 years. I had to pay $600 dues to the homeowners association before we could sell the house.
Yes.
So I remember I was not on council when, maybe in some of the earlier workshops for the lid, but I watched one, I can't remember which one. I did!
She was desperate.
Must have been
Because I
irony.
knew it was coming, and I think maybe I watched it, because one of you told me to watch it.
Oh.
Don't remember who, but somebody said, go back and find that video. So I did. And I remember in that presentation, excuse me, that there were some talks or some slides about in the individuals' lots, private properties, having to have certain types of landscaping with their little rain garden. Is that correct? That is in the so I remember in that slide, and then I remember there was talk about that those having to be inspected or something. Those in the private somebody's private backyard or front yard, however it goes, having to maintain some sort of so what I'm getting at, I guess, is there's going to be a cost on a private homeowner to maintain their own rain garden or whatever you want to call it, which.
And those are locked up in perpetuity. They can't get rid of it. It's part of the hydraulic system.
So are we, and to tie in Councilmember Omberg's question, we're going to have to enforce that they keep that as it should be per the book. Are we going to, if they don't take care of it, if it becomes what it's not doing what it's supposed to do with the rainwater, are we going to put a lien on their house if they don't? I mean, I can imagine somebody falling on hard times and it just going to crap. I just can't see, and I just can't wrap my head around our cost as a city, and thank goodness, like you said, we're not like building new neighborhoods every other day. But I cannot wrap my head around what we're going to have to do on somebody's private property and what we're going to make them maintain on their own property.
So our next topic is the challenges related to these LID measures that are constructed on private property. And they can't be removed because the entire drainage system is based on those improvements being installed and maintained and functioning as originally designed. And it's going to be a challenge for us to periodically inspect those. And how do we do that? Do we make sure that if they're going to include rain gardens or bioretention on private property, that it's in the front so that we don't have to worry about what's happening in the backyard? And we have had an instance where there were some homes that were built with LID measures. There was a rain garden in the backyard. It was in the backyard. It was in the front.
Filled in?
Yes, it was, and it was filled in, and we had to go out and tell them they had to put it back. Because a lot of people, especially when you're looking at these smaller lots and families with young kids, they want to have nice flat area, and they may not be able to have that much flat area if they have a rain garden on their property. But we do have to go out and make sure that they don't remove them. And personally, I would prefer anything that's LID related to be where we can see it and not have to worry about what's happening in the backyard. The next point is goes back to something that Councilmember Almberg brought up about if they install all of these LID features, are they still going to have a pond, detention pond? Well, they might, but there's something else. They're going to design the development so that the majority of the water stays on the site. Brad and another engineer, Alex, found a statement in the 2012 DOE manual that says roads should still be designed with adequate drainage conveyance facilities as if the road surface was impermeable. So DOE is suggesting redundant drainage systems. And so my concern, if we don't do that, and the LID measures on private property are not maintained, or they don't function as they thought they were going to function, we're not going to have an infrastructure in our street system to handle that increased runoff. But I have a real hard time increasing the cost to development and then asking them to put in a redundant drainage system for our roadway.
Part of the supposed cost savings of LID was that you would not be putting pipes and catch basins in the road. And here they have a statement telling us we should be doing that in addition to all the LID. We've already found out through experience that even when you don't do the pipes and catch basins, LID is more expensive than traditional. So now if you tack on the traditional system on top of LID, you're talking about a dramatic increase in cost.
So you end up with sheet flow, the downhill outfall, wherever that street comes out, you're going to have quite a volume of water down there unless you have interceptors along the way. So you are going to have a pipeline system at several points, I would imagine.
You might have under a pervious pavement, you might have an underdrain that collects it and routes it someplace.
Yeah.
And that underdrain's collected or designed would be designed to only operate when the storage under the road, under the pervious pavement gets so deep, when the water gets so deep into there, then the underdrain would start allowing water out. That's how I would do it, at least. But the point is, doing redundant systems is pretty pricey. And I don't think we're looking forward to telling developers to do that. We haven't figured this out yet.
So what if you don't tell developers to do it? I mean, is it
If
going to be
the-
inspected? Is somebody going to come and give us a fine? Is somebody going to?
The DOE is not mandating it. They use the word should.
Yeah, so what does that
And
mean?
I think that's so that when it does fail, if it does fail, they can tell us, well, you should have done this.
It's
It
not
absolves
shall.
it.
Yes.
Right. It absolves the DOE from failure of LID because they'll point to that sentence and say, well,
So
you
we
should
don't
have
have
pipes
to
and
do
catch
it.
basins.
Yeah.
We don't have to do it. However, if the LID measures on private property don't function, they stop working or they never functioned as they were designed, there will be an impact to the city's roadway system from runoff, and then that will be a cost to address for the entire city. So it's really a balance, and I think it's really important then that we put the measures in place, that we are inspecting and ensuring that all of the LID measures that are put in are functioning and continue to remain in place and function as originally designed, so that we don't have an issue down the road.
I know on some other things, is it possible to have workshops or require workshops so that they can't say they didn't understand our code or why we have to implement this? Because as you say, Brad says he's going to all these classes and no one else is showing up. And in Mukilteel, they're already.
Yes, I think that's the very next slide.
Yeah, okay.
So,
I won't take away your thunder.
Dennis, you want to talk about this one?
I wasn't prepared.
I got it.
I'll
So
talk about the last bullet.
Kathy wants the last bullet point. I'll talk about the boring process stuff. Really where we are right now is we'll have another briefing. You can see we have briefings with Planning Commission and with yourselves through September, October as well. We're contemplating having a joint workshop with you and the Planning Commission to see if that might work so that we have both bodies at the same time to kind of cover some of these things. We also like to try to do that every couple of years on topics, so that might be nice. Our goal right now is to have hearing with the Planning Commission in October, get to you folks at the second meeting in November, and then hopefully have adoption by the first meeting in December. We have a little bit of slide in there, but not very much. So that's kind of the process that we see so far. And then the last bullet point is what happens after it gets adopted.
Yes, and as I mentioned, initially we do have an obligation under our permit for education and outreach. And I think this is a great topic for us to make that outreach to the developers and the owners of large parcels of land and consulting engineers who may not have been attending the training. I know that SICPA is aware of it because they have been on our stakeholders group. Wayne Kreider has participated in those meetings, and they've been watching what's been happening throughout the Puget Sound. But there are going to be many that don't understand, and it's going to feel very different, and it's going to feel very much like we're being difficult when we require that they do all this work up front and submit the documentation that they've actually done that work, and we don't really have a choice. So.
Will we also include realtors, because they're going to be selling this product, and I can see someone get into their Facebook group. I mean, so that, as much as we can.
We'll try to broadly disseminate the information. We had a local realtor on our external group, and we'll reach out to more as well.
Or even, I know it's a lot of work, but your homeowners association, whoever the president is, or just some representation from the different homeowners we can't have that many homeowners in Oak Harbor, but invite them. Now, they don't come, but at least put it out there, because it's going to affect their neighborhoods, especially the ones that already have some rain gardens in them, or improvements that are going to be coming, what it would mean to their neighborhood if there was an improvement done, what they will or won't be. You got to try. Sure. Somehow. You just have to try.
Number?
This is really FYI, because we don't have bargaining leverage in this with DOE. So, and then the requirement for the outreach. So to what extent do we spend money doing the outreach when we have to go back to the manual anyway, and this is what you're going to do?
It's required by the NPDES program.
Yes, and so we do have regular outreach meetings with homeowners associations regarding the requirements of maintaining their existing detention ponds, and we have outreach to landscape contractors on best management practices. We have outreach to restaurants on proper storage of their oils and other best management practices. So we do that on a regular basis for permit compliance, but I think this effort will make our jobs easier when an application comes through development services and ultimately ends up on Brad's desk.
A half-day session with a handful of consulting engineers so that we can talk about it all at one time will save a lot of time on an individual application basis, hopefully, when they make those submittals, because otherwise our staff is in a position of having to communicate at school and write comment letters and say, you know, all of these things were missing. So, you know, a little upfront investment will probably pay dividends on the back end.
So in summary, we are still going to be required to treat and maintain the volume and the rate of runoff off of a new development at the pre-development rate based on an evergreen forest.
Yes, it's more complicated than that, but that's pretty close.
But that's where it's going. You just can't discharge greater than the pre-development rate.
What the systems you see now store water and release at a controlled rate.
Yeah.
The LID systems are trying to put the water back in the ground, which is a good thing. We want the water back in the ground, but it's hard to do and it's expensive. It takes a lot of land.
So then, one other thing, this conversation came up a long time ago with Stormwater 2, referring to DOT. Washington Department of Transportation has all these surfaces that are basically contaminated with petroleum and heavy metals. How come DOE requirements for, I know this is a NPDES requirement, but this is about the environment too. So why do not those regulations apply to them?
They do.
And it just to us?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, they do to DOT. DOT was allowed to produce its own manual called the Highway Runoff Manual, and it's went through some kind of review process and was accepted. It's considered, I'm not going to say it's equivalent, but it's specifically for them. I'm not sure if other agencies can use it or not. Certainly not for housing development, but maybe for roads. It's designed around long linear paving projects, basically. So it's different than the Department of Ecology manual. It's just they came up with it for their projects because the nature of their projects are different. So they do have similar requirements, but it's not quite the same.
They don't have treatment for heavy metals though.
It's been a while since I've dealt with it. I used to do that stuff for the state, but it's been at least 13 years, and I'm not sure where they are. Some of the metals probably are now regulated. Certainly hydrocarbons, turbidity are. I don't know where they are with zinc, copper, lead, that kind of thing. They are they have different low impact development best management practices, something like called a ecology embankment, which is similar to bioretention. It's very linear, it goes on the road shoulder, and it's designed to get heavy metals. But I'd have to do some research.
So I remember when you first introduced us, I think I was not the mayor, but I remember a conversation about the qualifications. I don't, that's not the right word. We're classified as a NPDES 2, Phase 2 city. And I remember one of the reasons is bull trout.
Yes, we were not brought in by population density. We were brought in as what was called a bubble city. There were several small cities that were brought into the permit under that term. The three reasons they gave us was the military was here. They wanted us to regulate their system, at least where it enters our system. Potential bull trout habitat and shellfish harvesting. Those are the three reasons.
The word potential bull trout habitat, has anybody argued about that?
I argued a long time ago. We're talking probably 8, 9, 10 years
It
ago.
was probably 2005.
Yeah.
We got our first permit in 2007.
Yeah. Bob Jarsky and I were the two leads on arguing those reasons, and we were shot down every time. We went to Ellensburg and argued that we had no control over the military, and we were told to sue the military. That's the DOE's answer was the city of Oak Harbor needs to sue the Navy to force them into compliance. The potential bull trout habitats and discussions with Fish and Wildlife, and they were told that it was kind of a broad net where they looked at the depths of bays and harbors with a certain depth range were generally classified as potential bull trout habitat. There was also voluntary sampling, some kind of reporting where if a fisherman caught a bull trout, they could fill out a form and say, I caught one in this location, send it in.
But fishermen are notorious liars.
So, and then the third, the shellfish, of course we do have shellfish here, but I believe it's illegal to harvest longer because of our sewage outfall, which I think is a federal law. So,
We're stuck.
Yeah, the Department of Ecology would, even though humans are not harvesting the shellfish, they'd say that, you know, otters and seals and starfish and other wildlife are eating it, and toxins could bioaccumulate up the food chain in the salmon, etc.
I wouldn't, you know, I'm just baffled why Island County isn't
Population
classified.
density is the reason. They just aren't dense enough.
Yes, I have a question. Back to this, sounds like it's mainly for new developments is what a lot of these regulations are, but can you explain just in a layman's term what qualifies as a redevelopment? Because I know that's thrown in there too when a lot of these requirements come on. What is a redevelopment?
Okay.
What's the definition?
Well, it's pretty well, I'll try to keep it simple, but remember this manual operates like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple flow charts in there. One's for a new development, and on that new development flow chart, it says, is your site comprised of 35% or more of impervious area? So if it is, so if you had a building with a parking lot, and that takes up a little over a third of the area of the site.
So if you had 10,000 square foot lot and 3,500 square feet
Yeah.
of it was.
Yep. So then you would go to the redevelopment flow chart, which is less rigorous. It has less requirements than the new development. It still has significant requirements, but they're not quite. There's a bit of a break. It's designed to. I don't know all the reasons, but part of the reasons it's designed this way is they want to see redevelopment, because instead of somebody going and tearing down a forest, they want to see somebody tear down a whole building, a whole parking lot, and redevelop that. And if they get a little bit of a break for redevelopment, you're doing that fits with the Growth Management Act also on density. So there is a little bit of a break, but it's not a huge.
And that applies to residential and business. It's
Yes.
the same. So if you, like I know there's a few empty lots around town I'll drive by. Let's say it's a bigger lot, not one of these, it's a lot in, like on Scenic Heights where we live or, anything. So if it's a 10,000 square foot lot and someone wants to build a 3,000 square foot home with a driveway that's,
You're going to trigger, you're definitely going to trigger LID requirements. And what you would probably trigger with that project is, if you have a larger project, most plats would trigger minimum requirements 1 through 9, meaning just pretty much everything. What you just described, you'd be 1 through 5, which are easier to satisfy and less costly. It's 6 and 7 that get real expensive. Those are the pervious. That's what's called flow control and water quality treatment, which is what most of LID is really
so
about.
even if it's 1 through 5, it's going to trigger like where
Rain
the
garden.
city, where Public
Yes.
Works is going to have to inspect it. So you're going to have different lots possibly thrown in all over the city that
Yes.
you're
Yes.
going to fall on your requirement to keep track of.
There's
And
a
you're
lot-
not going to be required to keep track of existing homes that, are, okay.
Right. We do if they, not existing homes, but existing neighborhoods that have the traditional system, we already
Yeah, have their
inspect
own.
the ponds,
Yeah, well, you
et
have
cetera,
your own
bioswales.
that are there.
This will
Not
be more-
individual
This will be a
properties.
lot more labor intensive, take more staff time. The key to making this LID work is making sure maintenance happens. If it's not maintained, the pervious pavements will clog. People fill in the rain gardens and bioretention, which are almost the same thing. they fill them in, if you can imagine if a 40 lot plat goes in and everyone has a rain garden in their yard, and then over a decade they all fill them in, all that water's got to go somewhere, where the whole system was designed for that water to go in the ground. If they fill it in, it just goes across the street, across the yard into the street, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Plus, as the water flows onto pervious pavements from other surfaces, it tends to carry a lot of dirt and clog the system.
But it also, to me, doesn't make sense if you've got an empty lot in the middle of a street or a neighborhood that's been developed 10 years ago, and you're making them do these requirements. It's kind of you've already built in that street the system. It's, again, it sounds to me like one of those double.
They're trying.
No.
The system is designed to return the hydrology of Western Washington to pre-European settlement. So as soon as you hit those triggers, they're trying to make you mimic what was here 200 years ago.
Okay, one more question though. So
Okay, that'll be it though.
Oh, sorry.
I think we got,
yeah.
we
Okay.
got somebody.
So, but in the timeline that's up here, we are going to be having budget talks, and we're working on our budget. Is there something for, as a city council member, that we need to make sure that is budgeted for, or is there any sort of projections, or what, is that in your considerations in your budgets that you're going to present to us? I mean, I know the new developments maybe, but these other redevelopments, I know those may happen more frequently,
So yes, we are requesting one new employee in the storm drain division to help us with the public education and outreach and inspections, and we're also asking for a reclassification of an employee to focus more on the stormwater management.
As time goes by and as these neighborhoods are built, we will need to budget for more equipment. There's specialized equipment to take care of the pervious pavements.
But we don't anticipate that till
that's going to be a while
at
down the road.
Okay.
least
Do you have a question?
2018 budget.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I forgot about the bull trout thing. I'm glad you brought that up. Being a fisherman, I would love to find those habitats. You mentioned, I think it was Dennis early on, we received a grant to study, or somebody we started off with studying the barriers to implementing LID. What was the desired outcome of that grant? Was it just to identify the barriers, or how to more successfully implement the requirements?
It was to find the barriers, but then identify where we could make changes in our code to allow LID to be more readily chosen as a development option.
Okay.
So we removed the barriers when we
barriers.
changed our code in 2011.
I understand. Okay, so it's phraseology. I didn't understand that grant. So my take on it, I agree with everyone. It might be a little different if we're being mandated essentially to do this. No one likes, the public, most people in general, I think, resist change. We're creatures of habit, especially if it's a mandated change that's going to cost them something. But I'm reminded, I just brought back a car that seatbelts weren't required when that car was built. So there are times when, lead paint, seatbelts, there are changes that are made that in the end are probably better for the environment. Yes, it includes an increased cost. I would have to think most HOAs, we have an HOA, and if we were to receive a letter, I think most of those, or even individual homeowners, would be compliant. And I would hope we would have an ordinance then, or the wording in our ordinances, if we need to adapt that we could comply them or compel them to hopefully comply with whatever those new industry standards are. If we sit here and think that, 20 years from now, that the regulations will be the same as they are today, I remember Brad bringing this up, and when the mayor said the bull trout thing, I'm like, oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that. So I know we're going to see this stuff, and I appreciate the staff's efforts to get this in front of us, to try and get the word out to the public that we're not trying to be difficult, but there's change on the horizon. If we're required to do it, let's embrace it. One of my business mentors always said, you'll be an architect of change or a victim of it. So I think this is an opportunity where we can be a little more progressive as a city, do everything we can. I appreciate the flexibility comments with builders and designers. But in the end, we're not going to dig our heels in. And I guess we could dig our heels in and fight the state, but it doesn't sound like that's going to be too effective. So to that degree, I just want to refrain or restate that I appreciate your efforts in being flexible. And as we go out to the public, know that fortunately we're not tapping a wand and affecting 6,000 utility customers at once. This will be a slow introduction as new development comes online. Thank you.
I'll say a couple of things. We've already started a couple of our budget meetings today. Dr. Merriman and I are hoping to get to council what we're calling a table full of things to think about. And hopefully you can give us some idea on where you think money should be spent if we have options, because we're going to have more requests than we have money. I can tell that already, pretty easy to see. And you'll be able to help make some of the choices, you know, where you'd like to see this done. But I would also like to echo what Mr. Servadius just said. I think that our staff has been working to find, their attitude, I think, is that they're working to find solutions. You know, if they've got things they're dealing with, decisions that have to be made, it seems to me that they're working maybe harder than ever to find if there's another way to do things. I know that Brad Gluth has worked on this for quite some time. In the beginning, you know, it almost seemed like it was going to stop what we're doing, or there was at least concern about that. But I think Brad has worked on ways and is thinking about other ways to do to get, you know, make sure that we can get something done, or have the developers think of another way to do things. I know Mr. Powers is certainly thinking that way, and I appreciate that. I really do. I know you've heard that from me quite a bit now, but thank you for doing that. So, anyone else got any? Yes, Brad?
Well, one project we might want to think about funding in the future, near future, is the Highway 20 flow diversion to the Friend Marsh project. It's been identified as a project since about '93. We have the flooding down by Burger King on Highway 20. If we can do the flow diversion to Friend Marsh area and create there was a constructed wetland trail system that was laid out in different permutations over the years. If we can do that, we can free up capacity in our system, and our main stormwater system, we have a couple of very large pipes that handle much of our city. If we can free up that capacity, we can probably assign more properties to the exempt water body, draining to exempt water body status that we were talking about earlier, where it drains to salt water. That means once those pipes get to the appropriate capacity, some of these rules won't apply to some of the properties closer to the shore.
Interesting.
And the way to get there is to do the Friend Marsh diversion project that's been around for 20 years.
Good, make a note of that. Did you get all that, Dr. Merriman? I did. I'll bet you did, probably did. Thanks. Brad has sent me a couple of ideas to think about, and I just appreciate that. When, you know, whether it's solar, we need to think out of the box, and thank you for continuing to do that. Anyone else got any? Okay, I think we're done for today. 4:47. Thank you for coming.
Hey,